Buenas tardes a todos, ¿me escuchan bien? Muchas gracias por estar acá. Veo caras conocidas. Es una ocasión muy especial para el Seminario Institucional Sociología de las Emociones. Cerramos un año lectivo más de trabajo colectivo y como es habitual, tenemos una invitada estelar en esta ocasión, la doctora Kathryn de la Universidad del College of Dartmouth de Estados Unidos. Así que para mí y para los miembros del seminario es un doble motivo de congratulación. Es para mí un gusto presentarles a la doctora Kathryn Lively. Ella es doctora en Sociología magna cum laude por la Universidad de Tulsa, Oklahoma, profesora de Sociología en el Dartmouth College, Hanover, New Hampshire, desde el año 2002. Fue directora del Departamento de Sociología de esa institución hasta hace poco, entre 2011 y 2015, y lo dejó para tomar su año sabático. Sus áreas de especialidad son las emociones, la psicología social, el género y la identidad. Ella da clases acerca de psicología social, sociología médica, teoría del control afectivo, trabajo, sociología de las emociones, salud mental, identidad, inequidad en el mundo familiar. Ella fue presidenta de la sección de Sociología de las Emociones de la Sociedad Americana de Sociología y ahora es presidenta de la sección de Psicología Social de esa misma asociación sociológica. Es coautora con Kent Sandstrom, Dean Martin y Gary Alfine del libro Symbols, Selves and Social Reality, a Symbolic Interactionist Approach to Social Psychology and Sociology, que va por su 4ª edición. Ha publicado numerosos artículos en prestigiadas revistas internacionales como el Journal of American Sociology, Social Forces, Social Psychology Quarterly, Symbolic Interaction, Work and Occupations, Group Processes. Ha sido merecedora de varios premios y reconocimientos por su destacada contribución al estudio y conocimiento en el campo de la sociología de las emociones, y solo voy a mencionar 2. En el año 2013 fue acreedora a la aportación al premio llamado Contribución Sobresaliente al campo de la sociología de las emociones, otorgado por la Sociedad Americana de Sociología con el trabajo Equity, Emotion and the Household Division of Labor, publicado posteriormente en el Social Psychology Quarterly. También recibió en el 2005 un reconocimiento de la misma Asociación Americana de Sociología y el mismo reconocimiento en 2005 por el trabajo Sociological Realms of Emotional Experience, publicado en el American Journal of Sociology. En el 2011 fue acreedora al mejor artículo en la sección de salud mental de la misma Asociación Americana de Sociología con el trabajo Investigating the Relationship Among Sex, Anger and Depression, publicado en la revista Social Forces. Como vemos, se trata de una joven, destacada investigadora que nos complace muchísimo que haya aceptado tomar esos aviones, levantarse a las 4 de la mañana y venir sin ninguna retribución a cambio a dialogar con nosotras en este grupo que hemos venido sosteniendo por tantos años y que en esta ocasión, cada vez que cerramos un año de trabajo, abrimos al resto de la comunidad mexicana para que puedan ser partícipes e intercambiar con estos destacados investigadores. Así que agradezco a la doctora Kathryn Lively una vez más. Ella nos va a hablar, como ustedes ven el título de su presentación. Su conferencia magistral se titula Sociological Approaches to Gender and Emotions, Culture, Social Structure and Identity, temas que son de mucho interés tanto para los que están en el seminario como para muchos de los presentes aquí. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Kathryn.
Well, I understand enough Spanish to be embarrassed by that introduction. Speaking of emotion. So first of all, thank you for coming today, and I'm very, very happy to be here. This is my first time in Mexico City, and it's really, really lovely. We went to the Frida Kahlo Museum for a little short tourism spot. I'd especially like to thank Marina for inviting me and for dealing with all of the logistics from getting me from New Hampshire, which is in the northeastern corner of the United States, here today. So my name is Kathryn Lively, and I'd like to talk to you about sociological approaches to the study of gender and emotion. And I'm going to be focusing on culture, structure, and identity. So my goal here today, not knowing how much work you had already done in this area, is to provide you with a brief history of the study of emotion and gender within U.S. sociology, and to illustrate how I have come to use formal social psychological theory, especially those related to identity processes, to gain a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between gender and emotion. I'll end by discussing potential new directions for study in this really important area. As requested in the invitation to me, I'll be drawing a good deal on my own scholarship. However, I'll also be bringing in examples from many other U.S. sociologists and social psychologists. So by way of introduction, I'm what most people would refer to as a second-generation emotions scholar. I received my PhD from Vanderbilt University in 1999, and my first publication in emotion appeared in Work and Occupation in the year 2000. Peggy Thoits was my advisor. Peggy was one of the key players in founding the American Sociological Association's first section on emotion in 1985. She coined the terms emotional deviance and interpersonal emotion management. She specified a 4-factor model of emotion that most sociologists adopt and was one of the first scholars to systematically approach emotion from a stress processes perspective. While I was at Vanderbilt, I was trained almost exclusively as a qualitative researcher, and I considered myself to be more of a culture/emotions person, a point to which I'll return. In 2000, however, I accepted a 2-year postdoc fellowship at the University of Indiana in Bloomington. Indiana University has one of the strongest social psychology departments in the United States. And while I was there, I took every quantitative methods class that I could, because I felt that even if I wanted to be a sociologist, I needed to at least to be able to read quantitative articles in order to be taken seriously. I also immersed myself in social psychological theory, namely Shel Stryker's symbolic interaction, which has come to be known as identity theory, social structure and personality, and affect control theory. So before I really get into the body of the talk, I'd like to spend just a moment on the why. That is, why do we, or why should we, care about the relationship between gender and emotion? Well, one of the reasons stems from the fact that emotion is an indicator of social inequality. That is, individuals who are structurally disadvantaged have significantly different emotional experiences than those who are structurally privileged. Additionally, emotionality, which has long been associated with women, serves as a justification for ongoing inequality. That is, individuals who are deemed as emotional or overly emotional or irrational are likely to be blocked from positions of power or prestige. And finally, gender is closely related to identity, of which gender is an important part. For women and men to successfully enact gender, they must do so within a particular set of culturally held and structurally maintained guidelines. So without a doubt, the most influential scholar in the sociology of emotion is Arlie Russell Hochschild, who in 1975 argued that a purely cognitive view of emotion or of human life was not sufficient for cognizant, conscious humans. Her insistence that emotion was socially patterned was partly explained by her concept of feeling rules, that is, culturally and historically variable norms defining what should be felt across a variety of situations. Her conceptualization of emotion work described the individual processes that maintained these norms. Emotion work occurs when actors experience a discrepancy between what they actually feel and what they should feel. Techniques used to change emotions include surface acting, which is to mask or to enhance the expression of feeling, and deep acting, wherein the actual emotion itself is changed. According to Hochschild, emotion work happens in private settings and has what she refers as a use value. That is, the person who actually does the emotion work benefits from that work. When emotion work is sold for a wage, however, it is performed for the benefit of an employer or a corporation, it becomes transmuted into emotional labor. Emotional labor is typically performed in the public sphere and has a monetary value, although oftentimes emotional labor remains uncompensated, particularly in female-dominated occupations. So just as Karl Marx was concerned that workers would become estranged from the fruits of their bodily labor, Hochschild cautioned workers who were engaged in emotional labor could also become estranged from their feelings, which in turn could problematize their relationship to self. So in the early days on emotions research, sociologists tended to adopt either a cultural perspective, that is Hochschild's perspective, or a more explicitly structural perspective. Most of the work coming out of the cultural perspective stems from qualitative and/or symbolic interactionist roots. Classic symbolic interactionism suggests that much of social reality is constructed through negotiated action and communication during the course of our everyday lives. Symbolic interactionists tend to focus more on the ways that individuals construct, maintain, and resist social structure and culture in their daily lives, while paying less sustained attention to the more stable and enduring features of social life. In contrast, the structural perspective is less concerned with the malleability of emotion. Instead, structuralists assume that emotions are structurally patterned and that they represent a legitimate response to events and outcomes. It's not that structuralists think that emotions can't be managed. That's just not what they're interested in. So studies coming from a more cultural perspective tend to focus on things like norms, rules, and emotion management, both intra-personal emotion management and interpersonal emotion management. Intrapersonal emotion management are the attempts that one makes to manage his or her own emotions by changing the situation behaviorally or cognitively, by changing the expression of the emotion, by changing the label that they assign to that emotion, or by changing the actual physiological response. Interpersonal emotion management, on the other hand, are the attempts that one makes to manage the emotions of other people. So my own early work on paralegals is a clear example of the cultural perspective. So relying on data that I collected from 52 paralegals, the majority of whom were women, I documented 3 behavioral and emotional norms that the paralegals co-created among themselves during the course of their daily interactions. And these were professionalism, deference, and caretaking. I also showed how the paralegals engaged in what I called reciprocal emotion management in Goffman-like backstage areas so that they could actually continue doing the emotional labor out front for the benefit of their attorneys and clients. Reciprocal emotion management referred to the emotion management that individuals of similar status participate in collaboratively over time and with an ongoing expectation for reciprocity. So I'll be honest, as a graduate student who had been completely enamored with the more cultural aspects of Hochschild's The Managed Heart, I really hadn't conceptualized structure all that well. Even though I was aware of the fact, because I had worked in a law firm, that law firms, like most work settings, are stratified. I also hadn't really thought through gender, even though the bulk of my respondents were female. However, I did realize that I needed to think more clearly about structure, which resulted actually in my third paper in 2002, where I showed how the differential structures of small versus mid-sized law firms affected both the amount and the type of emotion work / emotional labor that paralegals were likely to perform. So for instance, paralegals who worked in small firms with a lot of client contact performed more emotional labor for clients and actually had very good interpersonal relationships with their attorneys. Paralegals who worked in mid-sized law firms, however, with very little client contact, did very little emotional labor for clients, and actually had very bad interpersonal relationships with their attorneys. And I knew I needed to think more closely about gender because I had quotes in my data that said things like this. It's just like we're married. I bring him his coffee, I pick up his dry cleaning, I even take his dog to the vet. From a 46-year-old female paralegal speaking of her relationship with her male attorney versus this. It's just like we're married. When she's wrong, I tell her she's wrong, says a 47-year-old male paralegal of his female attorney. So not only did these quotes start me thinking about gender, they also started me thinking about family, particularly what various family roles entailed and how men and women might be viewing them differently. So, although most of the scholarship coming out of the cultural perspective focuses on emotional norms and how social order is maintained, the cultural perspective also addresses the issue of emotional deviance. First coined in 1985 by Peggy Thoits, emotional deviance can be thought of the realization that one's feelings don't match the culturally shared feeling rules, and or that the attempts that you've made to manage your emotions have actually failed. In her classic work, Emotional Deviance as Self-Labeling, Thoits theorized that individuals who are unable to manage their emotions on their own or through informal means may in fact self-label or label themselves as being emotionally deviant. Once an individual self-labels as emotionally deviant, they may be more inclined to voluntarily seek treatment from emotion management specialists in the form of counselors, psychologists, coaches, and ministers. Her analysis revealed that individuals are more likely to seek help for emotional deviance than they are for mental health concerns, because emotional disturbances are seen as more transitory and therefore less stigmatizing. Scholars who study emotional deviance almost universally address the stigmatizing effect of being labeled emotionally deviant and the effect that this has on one's identity. So notably, and somewhat interestingly, most of the studies of emotional deviance post Peggy Thoits tends to take place within families. Almost without fail, family scholars who take this approach have focused their attention on mothers, with surprisingly little attention paid to fathers or other family members such as siblings, grandparents, cousins, etc. Part of this may be explained by the strong cultural expectations that many societies have around mothering and what it means to be a good mother. It may also reflect U.S. sociologists' enduring focus on the so-called standard North American family, which almost by definition is nuclear and includes only 2 generations. Due to recent demographic shifts, however, there has been an increasing attention paid to the emotional lives and deviance of adult daughters, particularly in their role as care providers for their elderly parents. This uptick in interest may be attributed to Thoits' contention that emotional deviance is most likely to occur when one experiences role conflict or other types of strain. So in Jennifer Lois's recent ethnography of homeschooling mothers, is homeschooling a thing here like it is in the US? Okay. So homeschooling, when people choose to take their kids out of public school or private school and to school them at home. In Jen Lois's recent ethnography, she revealed that mothers who homeschooled often managed accusations of emotional deviance by narratively reframing their feelings as being consistent with the cultural norm of being a good mother. So the feelings that they had originally had, which led them to homeschool, as being consistent. So mothers who homeschooled also managed the negative emotions associated with being both mother and teacher, that is frustration, irritation, fear, anxiety, burnout, etc., by altering their understanding of their situation, by altering their situation of themselves, their husbands, who didn't help very much, by the way, their children, as well as their perception of time. Drawing on Michael Flaherty's increasingly influential notion of time work, Lois's analysis revealed that homeschooling mothers learned or taught each other how to think about the future, a time in which their children wouldn't be at home, as a way to actually elicit nostalgia for the present moment. And that was one way in which they were able to manage their negative feelings. Okay, so I characterized the early days as having either coming out of the cultural perspective or the structural perspective. So at this point, I'd like to shift gears and turn the conversation away from emotion management, norms, and deviance per se, and towards the more structural considerations of emotion, such as power, status, stressors, and shields. So as noted, the structural perspective is less concerned with the malleability of feelings or standards of emotional deviance. Instead, structuralists assume that emotions are structurally patterned and legitimate responses to events and outcomes. So they don't think emotions are irrational at all. They're perfectly legitimate responses to whatever it is that you're facing. So I'd like to briefly introduce 3 theories that have come to be associated with the structural perspective. The first is Theodore Kemper's social interactional theory of emotion. The second is Leonard Perlin's stress model. And the third is actually Arlie Hochschild's notion of status shields, even though she's actually usually considered a cultural sociologist. So the person most closely associated with this approach, at least by name, is Theodore Kemper. And he posits that many emotions are a function of power and status. And so power simply refers to authority, or the ability to tell someone what to do and to have them do it. Status, however, refers to prestige or honor. So these are sort of Weberian in their roots. And so it refers to prestige or honor rather than one's position within an organization or status structure. His social interactional theory of emotion posits that individuals have a certain idea about how much power or status that they are expected to receive or to confer in a given interaction. When their expectations aren't met, they have a patterned, legitimate emotional response. Emotional responses are predicted to vary by a number of factors, including the actor's relationship with their interaction partner, as well as attributions of responsibility. So for an example, as a professor, I generally have an idea about how much status I expect to receive in my interactions with my undergraduate students. I also know how much power I should or need to exert in order to achieve my basic interactional goals. When I do not receive the status that I expect, say that the student comes to class late, fails to come to a meeting, or fails to respond to my questions in class, I'm very likely to feel angry. However, I might feel guilty if the student's tardiness or their inability to respond was actually a result of my own actions or ineptitude. Likewise, if I have to use a lot of power, one could say too much power due to the student's action, I'm still likely to be angry. However, my relationship with the student, the degree to which I like him or her, could change my emotional response to remorse or sadness. So there are a lot of different ways this could go. But it's structured and it's replicatable. The less influential among those who study emotion, yet no less relevant, is a second structural approach that comes out of Leonard Perlin's stress model. The stress model assumes that individuals who occupy lower status positions in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, social class, etc., pick the dimension. If you're on the lower end, you're more likely to be in situations where you are subject to stressors. So there are 2 different types of stressors. Stressors can include daily hassles, and these would include things like being insulted by a neighbor, having a flat tire, losing your keys, having a dead battery in your car, as well as major life events such as major illness, divorce, death in the family, losing a job, or losing your home, like through foreclosure, etc. Lower status individuals are also assumed to have a less effective social support system, either in terms of instrumental support, so getting help from people within your social network, or emotional support, so people who can support you emotionally. And those who have less effective social support means that your support network is less likely or less able to buffer the negative effects associated with those stressors. Although stressors may result in physical symptoms like hypertension, high blood pressure, various types of illness, they also have been tied to negative emotional outcomes such as depression, anger, and anxiety. And finally, Hochschild herself, though not typically associated with a strictly structural perspective, makes a similar argument, suggesting that certain people, such as women, racial and ethnic minorities, the poor, etc., may have lower status shields than others, such as men, racial and ethnic majorities, the wealthy, etc. And here's why she's not strictly structural. So status shields are the culturally shared interpretive dispositions that protect privileged persons against the displaced feelings of others. 2, the negative interpretation of one's own emotional expressions. And 3, the conviction of others that one's emotions are unwarranted or unimportant. An obvious example of a structured lack of status shield in the U.S. is the chronic undermining of women's anger by interpreting them as crazy, emotional, hormonal, or irrational. So for example, stop asking me if I'm on my period every time I'm upset. Another example of the undermining of African American men's anger is a function of them simply being an angry black man. In the U.S., the aggregate of such interpretations serve white male dominance, not only in the workplace, but also at home and in other small task-focused groups, such as juries. So as you might guess, the structural approach, with its focus on reactions as opposed to the processes of emotion management, is much more likely to be associated with quantitative data, either in the form of large-scale surveys or experiments. One of the most important recent scholars in this tradition is Robin Simon, who is a professor of sociology at Wake Forest University in South Carolina. And if you haven't invited her, maybe you should. In their 2008 article, Robin and her co-author, Leda Nath, tested cultural expectations, such as women are more emotional than men, and structural expectations, such as emotions arise from social conditions, against one another. Much to their surprise, since Robin was also a cultural sociologist, they found a little support for the cultural understandings of gender and emotion. In fact, once socio-demographic variables in social statuses, such as marital status, employment, and parenthood, were controlled for, gender differences in self-reported emotional experiences virtually disappeared. The only 2 differences that remained were women's higher levels of self-reported anger, an emotion that we culturally ascribe to men, at least in the US, and distress. Simon and Nath did report some gender differences in how women and men tried to manage their anger, which does speak a little bit more about norms. However, there was no difference whatsoever in whether or not individuals believed that their anger response was appropriate. And appropriateness was actually a variable that was designed to capture the experience of emotional deviance. So women actually believed that their anger was just as appropriate as did men. So in order to follow up on these somewhat counterintuitive findings, Robin Simon and I began using the same data, the 1996 General Social Survey Emotions module, to see what we could figure out about what was going on with women's depression and women's anger. So it's worth noting that nearly all of the quantitative results that I'm going to share with you today are based on the GSS Emotions module, which was a nationally representative sample of US adults published in 1996. It was, at the time, and still is, the only nationally representative data set of the US population that includes a variety of emotional outcomes. The GSS includes a question about the frequency of 19 separate emotional states or different emotions. The GSS also has a subset of questions about anger that had to do with the target of the anger, like who are you angry with, the emotional expression, emotion management, emotional deviance, intensity, and duration. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the data after the talk. So given that none of the usual suspects, that is the socio-demographics and the social statuses, seem to make a dent in the differences in women's and men's anger and depression, we turned our attention to Randall Collins's ritual interaction theory of emotion, another good structural emotions theorist. So the ritual interaction theory of emotion posits that when anger is intense and enduring, and there is no recourse for corrective action, that it is likely to transform into depression. Of course, there's also a possibility that individuals who are already distressed may simply be more sensitive to anger-inducing events. So our analysis revealed that the consistent relationship between gender and depression within the United States, a problem that has stymied mental health researchers for decades, can actually be explained by women's more intense and enduring anger. In other words, once we controlled for the intensity and the duration of anger, the relationship between sex and depression became non-significant. The supplementary analysis revealed, because we were like, what's going on there? So supplementary analysis revealed that women were more likely to report being angered by situations that involved the family, and that events involving the family tend to elicit anger that is more intense and of longer duration than those events involving work. So along similar lines, one of the most unpopular papers in recent history within the subfield, Robin and her collaborator, Renee Evanson, found that all kinds of parents, biological parents, adoptive parents, step-parents, parents of children no longer living at home, parents of children under the age of 5, etc., all had worse emotional outcomes, at least in terms of depressive symptoms, than non-parents. They argued that parents, as a result of their structural position as parents, were simply exposed to more chronic and daily stressors than non-parents, which resulted in poor emotional outcomes. I say that this paper was unpopular because it contradicted long and deeply held cultural assumptions and understandings about parenthood within the United States and globally, as we found out. As a result of this paper, Robin was besieged by the media from as far as India, print, web, radio, and television for weeks, where she was forced to defend her findings and to elaborate on the implications of her work for motherhood, parenthood, etc. So in one of my first attempts to disaggregate the effects of culture and structure, as well as to better understand the role of gender and emotion, was a project that I worked on with Brian Powell, who is a family scholar at Indiana University. So using multinomial logistic regression, we looked at emotional expression. So multinomial logistic regression, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the same as binomial logistic regression, except that it has more than two outcomes. And so our emotional expression dependent variable captured the likelihood that someone who had experienced anger in the last 30 days would, 1, speak to the target of their anger, 2, speak to someone else without also speaking to the target, speak to both the target and someone else, or to simply say nothing at all. So that was our dependent variable. We were also looking specifically at the effects of domain. So did this anger happen in the workplace, or did it involve family members? And we were looking at status. So was the target of higher status, similar status, or lower status? And sex. And we were able to look at both the sex of the respondent as well as, in a small subset, the sex of the target. So we found that individuals were more likely to express their emotions directly to the target who was also a family member than they were to speak directly to someone at work. Moreover, they were less likely to speak to someone of higher status and more likely to speak to someone of lower status, regardless of whether that event involved work or family members. So what they always say is negative emotions flow down. It's true. Thus, the status mechanism worked the same way across both contexts. Finally, once context, which was our marker for culture, and status, which is how we were thinking about structure, was controlled, the previously significant effects of gender, which unfortunately was measured as sex, went to zero. And it didn't matter whether or not the target was male or female. So supplementary analysis, interestingly, revealed that the effects of context and status, or culture and structure, explained approximately the same amount of the variance in the dependent variable. Okay, so during this era, you had a lot of qualitative scholars who were still emphasizing the normative effects of gender when it came to understanding the experience, expression, and the management of emotion. At the same time, you had quantitative scholars, like myself and Robin, who were suggesting that gender differences, at least sex differences in emotion, might actually be a function of women's position within the social structure. Because I was still somewhat wedded to the cultural perspective, and I really didn't see these two as mutually opposing, but rather complementary, I began turning my attention to social psychology. So there are many reasons why social psychology provided an attractive alternative to the existing paradigms within the sociology of emotion. One, social psychology is a much more developed subfield than emotion, yet it deals with many of the same issues: power, status, gender, interaction. Social psychology also comes with a ready-made set of formal theories, complete with easily testable hypotheses. At the time that I was doing this research, most of the formal social psychological theories had only been examined in laboratory settings using undergraduate students as their samples. Using the GSS, or the General Social Survey's emotion module, the data on which almost all of this work is based, I was able to test these hypotheses using nationally representative data of adults. So not only could I use the theories to enrich my understanding of emotion and gender, I could also bring a richer understanding of emotion and gender into existing social psychological theory. The two major social psychological theories that I began using to frame my work on gender and emotion were equity theory and affect control theory. That said, there are several other social psychological theories that within the last 10 years have been expanded to include emotion, such as identity theory, exchange theory, justice theory, and status expectation states theory. It's worth noting that all of these theories, albeit using different mechanisms, all assume that people have an idea about how they should fare in a given situation. So it's not that different than even Kemper. And when they don't, they have some sort of an emotional response. So we'll start with equity theory. So according to equity theory, when one experiences a perceived inequity in either direction, they're likely to experience negative feelings. It's important to note that equity is a subjective understanding of what's fair. So this shouldn't be confused with equality, which actually means like doing your share, period. So if there's two of you, you do half, I do half. But for in terms of equity, you could do 3/4, and I'm doing a fourth, and if we both think it's fair, it's okay. So equity theory states that if one feels under-benefited, that is, they feel like they're doing more than their fair share, or that they have received less than their fair share, that they're likely to experience distress. So that seems pretty intuitive. Likewise, if one feels over-benefited, that is, that they're doing less than their fair share or receiving more than their fair share, that they would also likely experience distress. So originally, equity theorists limited their analysis to distress, a rather undifferentiated measure of upset. However, later scholars, such as Karen Hegvit, disaggregated this state to include both fear, which is the likely outcome for those who felt that they were over-benefiting, and anger, the likely outcome who felt that they were under-benefiting. So one of the earliest applications of equity theory in real-world settings was the study of the relationship between depression, usually captured by the Community Epidemiological Survey Depression Scale, and the household division of labor, that is housework. So the bulk of these empirical studies, based on large US population surveys, tended to follow the lead of the early developments within the theory. So specifically, they used distress as an undifferentiated emotional outcome. They focused disproportionately on the experience of under-benefiting, in this case, doing more than your fair share. And presumably, based on long-held beliefs about gender and gender roles, which influence who does what around the house, as well as recent surveys that show that in the US, husbands still do only about 1/3 of the household labor, they focused disproportionately on the experience of wives. So in order to address what we saw as the limitations of this genre, as well as some of the experimental studies through which equity theory was originally developed, my co-authors and I used data from two large-scale surveys, this time the GSS and the National Survey of Family and Households, to test the fundamental principles of equity theory using nationally representative samples of adults. So we did so by, one, examining emotional responses to the experience of both under and over benefiting. Two, we compared the experiences of both women and men. And three, we did so by relying on a range of emotional states, so discrete emotional states as opposed to a depression scale. And of course, all of this was embedded in relationships of long-term intimate partners as opposed to minimally acquainted undergraduate students. So what we found is the following. So to begin with, we found that the actual amount of housework performed by self and partner had no bearing at all on self-reported emotions, suggesting that equality in the household division of labor has no significant bearing on emotional well-being or distress. So you could do 2 hours and I could do 80, and if I thought that was fair, we're good. So didn't matter. So, however, we did find the core assertion of equity theory, that is that perceived inequity in either direction is likely to result in negative feelings, and that this was true for both women and men. Further, when you looked at specific emotions, you find that different emotions are implicated depending on the direction of the inequality or inequity. For instance, under-benefiting is significantly related to feelings of distress, rage, anger, and sadness, whereas over-benefiting is associated with distress, fear, and self-reproach. Positive emotions remained unperturbed by perceptions of inequity, which actually undermines some qualitative scholars' claims that women benefit or get a sense of pride and even joy from doing more than their fair share around the home. A more nuanced analysis revealed that men were significantly more likely to experience anger and rage when perceiving that they were doing more than their fair share compared to women in similar circumstances. And women were more likely to experience fear and self-reproach when faced with perceptions of having done less than their fair share, again, compared to men who were in similar circumstances. So this finding led us to suggest that one of the reasons why women may continue to do more than their fair share is because it's actually a way to manage their own and their partner's negative emotions. She agrees. So, okay. So at the same time, I can stop now. Okay. So at the same time that I was delving into the intricacies of equity theory, I was also working with David Heiss, the developer of affect control theory. So established in the mid-1970s, affect control theory is based on the premise that individuals create events that confirm their fundamental sentiments of the major components of social events. And the components of a social event include actors, behaviors, objects, settings, attributes, and emotion. When individuals find themselves in events that disconfirm their fundamental sentiments, they're likely to do something, either behaviorally or cognitively, in order to bring their situated sentiments back in line with their fundamental sentiments. And I'll unpack that as I go. So typically, events are conceived as actor behavior object events, such as mother kisses baby. And so mother is the actor, kiss is the behavior, and baby is the object of the behavior. It's also possible to consider more complicated events, such as happy mother kisses happy baby in grocery store, which would include the attributes of happy for both the actor and object, as well as the grocery store, such as the setting. So each of the elements in the social event, again, the actor, the behavior, the object, the setting, the attribute, and the emotion, can be characterized in terms of fundamental sentiments. That is how we feel about something. It's almost like a gut impression. It's not what we know about it, it's what we feel about it. It's before cognition. So this was actually developed as a corrective for symbolic interaction, which is very, very cognitive. And so this is sort of an affective process. So these sentiments that we have about the elements of an event are derived from media, from social interactions, or personal experience, and are measured in terms of three fundamental dimensions of affective meaning. And so there's evaluation, which we refer to it as E. It refers to how good or bad something is. Potency, how potent or impotent something is, or how powerful or weak something is. And activation, how lively or quiet something is. So here's a visual representation. And so when you have people measure how they rate things, you put it on a scale on these polar opposites. So these three dimensions have been validated over 40 cultures and have long been used as the basis of semantic differential measurement. So there's a long history of using this type of scaling. Okay, so the EPA profiles of the elements of social events comprise what the fundamental sentiments. And it's important to note that fundamental sentiments are acontextual. And so what I mean by that, for instance, we all pretty much agree that mothers are good and rapists are bad, right? Okay. So transient sentiments are those sentiments or feelings that arise in a particular event, such as mother kisses baby or rapist accosts co-ed. So neither of these events seem all that surprising because they both confirm fundamental sentiments about mothers and rapists and to a certain degree about babies and co-eds. When one's transient sentiments do not correspond with the fundamental sentiment, a deflection occurs, and you can think of a deflection as a measurement of discrepancy. So affect control theorists use EPA values, which are stored in sentiment dictionaries, to analyze social events. And so this is a screenshot of the homepage of Interact, the computer program that models affect control theory's core assumptions. So Interact allows you to model social events in order to mathematically model them in order to determine likelihood or unlikelihood. So how likely or unlikely is an event to occur based on our cultural understandings of these actors' identities, settings, behaviors, and attributes, as well as the subsequent behaviors, emotions, and the labels that can be applied to both the actor and the object. So there is a basic setting and an advanced setting. And so here's the screen setting. And so I'm showing you the advanced settings. In the first column, you see there's a sample of the different types of settings for which we have EPA values. And in the middle, these are different types of social role identities that for actors or the objects. And so you can see there's quite a few, like from A all the way down to Z. And this third column are the actual attributes. And what's interesting is that you can actually model situations or situations or events from both the perspective of person one or person two. So you can actually look at what happens when people have different definitions of an event. So it's actually pretty fancy, but we're not going to go that far today. Next year. Okay. So to give us an idea of the type of things, however, you can do, let's look at our example of mother kisses baby. And you can see that up here on the blue line. And so there's a lot going on here, but I just want to highlight using the red circle that the deflection score is 3.7. So the behavior, so that event, creates a deflection score of 3.7, which is pretty low. So in fact, anything falling in the, you can't really see it, but the green quadrant, like this lower quartile, is considered to be really low deflection. So this simply lets you know that the event confirms the identity of both the mother and the baby. So it seems likely that a mother would kiss a baby. And it's not necessary to engage in any particular behavior in order to reset the fundamental sentiments regarding the mother or the baby following this particular event. The box object labels down here, and I guess I don't know if you can read this or not, provides the answer to the question, what type of person is likely to be kissed by a mother? And so the response is little sister, house guest, stepsister, housewife, cousin. So what all of these identities have in common, other than their similar EPA profiles, is they all occur within the domestic realm, and they all tend to be female. So these are actually all identities that are similar in terms of their levels of evaluation, potency, and activation. And so if a mother kissed any one of these people, it would create similar levels of deflection. So compare this event to mother kicks baby, which is my favorite one to use in class because students always cringe. Okay, so look at the deflection. It's like way up here. Actually, you can't even see it, but it's 31.6, and it's 31. Not 3.6, 31.6. So this is an unlikely event in the sense that it disconfirms both identities. The high deflection score tells you that this event seems very unlikely. In fact, it's off the charts or beyond the realm of believability. From the theory's perspective, the event is unlikely because you essentially have a very good, powerful actor, that is the mother, doing a very bad, very powerful action to a good, relatively powerless object, that is the baby. So culturally, we expect good, powerful actors to take care of good, powerless objects, and the model captures this. It captures many of our cultural assumptions, including victim blaming. So notice that the most likely object behaviors in the red box, that is the baby's behavior, to reset the two identities back to something approximating the culturally shared fundamental sentiments, would be to entreat, correct, jest with, etc. So it's probably not reasonable to assume that a baby would entreat, jest with correct, etc. The pattern is consistent with domestic violence literature, which shows how victims often act in increasingly placating and friendly ways in order to reset their relationships with their abusers. So taking an even deeper look into EPA values, so the data that Interact uses in order to run these computer simulations are the evaluation, potency, and activation profiles. Again, the fundamental sentiments associated with actors, behaviors, objects, emotions, attributes, and settings. Here are just a few of the EPA profiles so that you can get a better idea about what I'm talking about. And so the range is negative 4.3 to positive 4.3. So as you can see, like mothers, fathers, and babies are all positive actors in terms of their evaluation. They all seem as very good. However, females rate mothers as significantly nicer than do males, so 3.12 versus 2.48. And they also rate mothers as significantly more powerful than do males. And so that's the 2.98 versus the 1.96 values. Women also rate babies as being significantly nicer, more powerful, I should say less weak, and more active compared to men. And one could argue that's because women have more experience with dealing with babies than do men. They also rate fathers and rapist, which is one of the most negatively evaluated identities in the dictionary, as significantly more active compared to males. And so affect control theory stores the data by males and females so you can actually look at how the sentiments vary by gender. I've also included a section on emotion, or a selection of emotions. And as you can see here, women see joy as being much more positive in terms of evaluation and much more active than do men. And men see being afraid as much weaker than do women. So there are also differences in this EPA values in terms of emotion. So you can learn more about affect control theory at Indiana University's website. And you can also download the Interact computer program for your own use if you want to play with it. And there's also an incredible 176-page PDF user guide, which is actually very useful. And I worked through it in a day, and I learned a lot. So during the time that I was learning affect control theory and thinking about gender differences in affective sentiments, I also began thinking seriously about the ways in which emotions co-occur and how this might be related to emotion management. So one of the many ideas that came out of my discussions with David Heiss, again, the founder of ACT, was this idea of emotional segues. So the idea was really simple. Short moves between emotions that are experientially near or that co-occur within a 7-day period are easier to accomplish than those that are experientially distant or that don't co-occur. So further, traveling sequentially through multiple emotion states so might be easier than making a single jump between two emotions that are relatively far apart. So it's important to note that this idea is not new. There are very few good ideas that are new. Rather, this idea is consistent with those early qualitative studies of interpersonal emotion management that I had fallen in love with as a graduate student, where scholars like Peggy Thoyts, Linda Francis, David Heiss, Lori Brett, Patricia Wesliaski, and Thomas Sheff showed that some emotional transitions are more easily accomplished and may even require transitioning through multiple emotions. So this is an ugly table, and Heiss and I tested this data in part by creating an emotional map of emotional experience that was based on the correlations between latent emotion variables and the shortest paths between them. So we began by looking at the correlations between emotions, and they're represented here in the lower part. So this is the correlation between hope and tranquility. This is the correlation between joy and tranquility, hope and tranquility, joy and tranquility, pride and tranquility, etc. You don't really need to spend too much time looking at this. We then used a network method known as shortest path analysis, Shortest path analysis allowed us to create a map of the relative distance in the shortest paths between emotions. And you can think about it as basically creating higher order correlations between the correlation matrix. And so you can see the shortest paths and the distances between them up in the upper triangle or above the red line. And so this is complicated table and sort of ugly. You may not even be able to see it in the back. So I'll just walk you through some of the highlights. So notice that some of the shortest paths don't require transitions, such as the shortest paths between tranquility and hope, which has a distance of 4, or tranquility and joy, which has a distance of 5, and those are indicated in the left rectangle. However, some do. So as you get to the more distant emotions, particularly positive and negative pairs, they actually do require some what we call segueing emotions. So for instance, the shortest path between tranquility and fear occurs through hope, as indicated by the red triangle, and the distance is reduced to 10 from 18. So almost by half there. So likewise, the shortest path between tranquility and distress in the far right-hand corner, not in the red line, right here, enjoys transitioning through hope and fear, a transition that reduces the distance by more than 1/3, from 18 to 11. So notably, many of these pathways, particularly those involving the distant emotions, are consistent with Wasilewski's and Sheff's sentiment or discourse analysis of political speeches, Britton Heiss's analysis of identity-based social movements, and Theutz's participant observation of psychodrama encounter groups, as well as Francis's ethnography of support groups for the bereaved and recently divorced. So you may be wondering at this point, what does this have to do with affect control theory? And why did she just spend 10 minutes talking about fundamental sentiments and EPA values? And the answer is, as this diagram shows, my results suggest that the shortest paths actually occur along those 3 fundamental dimensions of affective meaning upon which affect control theory is based. That is the EPA profiles, evaluation, potency, and activation. So as illustrated here, the segue, or the path between rage and tranquility is shortened if you go through joy. And you can get from rage to joy because of the similarity in activation, 1.81, 1.84, even though they're polar in terms of their evaluation, which is negative 1.65 and 2.84. And then you can transition easily from joy and tranquility because their evaluation is so similar, 2.33 and 2.83. So while thinking about the implication of this emotions map, as well as the significant gender differences in the affective sentiments, I also started rethinking that issue about gender and emotion management. Because even though I had published that work which suggested that men and women were equally likely to express anger to the target of said anger once cultural and structural issues were accounted for, I still couldn't quite let go of that idea that men and women and their emotional experiences were somehow different. So I decided to create another emotions map, this time looking at men and women's emotions separately. So as we did in the original study, I began by looking at the correlations between the 9 latent emotion variables under consideration. And as you can see here, men, shown in the bottom, have many more statistically significant correlations between positive and negative emotions than do women, who are shown in the positive, in the top part of the map. So for instance, with women, pride is positively correlated with only 2 negative emotions, anger and fear. However, for men, pride is positively correlated with 5 negative emotions, distress, anger, fear, rage, and self-reproach. So my shortest path analysis of these correlations revealed even more nuanced differences. So without spending too much time here, again, another ugly table, though I'm happy to come back to it, notice that many of the direct paths differ for men, represented in the lower triangle, and women, who are in the upper triangle. Also notice that some of the paths for women require transitioning through multiple emotions, as indicated in the rectangle, whereas none of men's paths do. And note that many of the emotions that comprise the shortest paths for women and men are qualitatively different. So stepping back from the numbers, what I found was the following. Women's shortest paths are more complicated. That is, women have more shortest paths that require segueing, period. They also have segues that require transitioning through multiple emotions, whereas men don't. Women's shortest paths seem to be less efficacious, meaning that their shortest paths, even those with similar or more complexity, remain longer or more distant than those of their male counterparts. Women's shortest paths are accomplished by segueing through emotions that are culturally deemed female or feminine. That is, their shortest paths use emotions, such as joy or fear, that are viewed as less powerful and more active. So these differences, even though they might seem abstract in that table, are consistent with the literature on rumination, as well as qualitative studies of men's and women's emotion management strategies, some of which came out of my own work on paralegals, but also from Hochschild's study of dual income parents, as well as Lois's work on rescue workers, among many others. They're also consistent with mental health studies which illustrate that women are more likely to experience more days of depression than men, as well as my work with Rob and Simon on the stronger relationship between women's anger and depression. They're also consistent with fMRI studies which illustrate that the emotional centers of men's brains are more tightly clustered, whereas women's are more widely dispersed. Incidentally, I also ran this by age, just to see, comparing individuals who are below 60 and who are 60 and above. These results, too, are consistent with findings coming out of psychology, which have documented differences in the emotional experiences of the elderly. So where does this leave us? The cultural studies point us to the importance of studying gender differences. Structural studies consistently find that when structure is controlled, gender, typically conceptualized by sex, goes away. However, structural conditions are real and rarely go away or controlled away in real life. So one of the reasons why I turned to social psychological approaches in the first place is because some of them, especially affect control theory, seem to do a better job than either the cultural or the structural perspective in specifying how culture and structure come together in ways that are simultaneous as well as complementary. Affect control theory does this with its focus on social role identities, roles being the very thing that tie individuals to the groups, organizations, and the social structures in which they are embedded. The consideration of fundamental sentiments, that is, how we as a culture feel about these roles, also allows us to tap into culture in a deep and systematic way. Indeed, the social psychological research on gender across a variety of spheres seems to suggest that gender differences may be the culturally patterned response to structural conditions. The degree to which this also applies to emotion, gender differences in emotion also seem to be a culturally patterned response to structural conditions. So historically, sociologists have used two seemingly competing perspectives to study gender and emotion. The first of these, the cultural perspective, tends to draw its evidence solely from ethnography, in-depth interviews, content analysis, or other forms of qualitative methods. The second of these is the structural perspective, which tends to draw its evidence from large-scale surveys or other forms of quantitative methods. Recently, a small group, myself included, have turned to specific social psychological theories in order to guide their work. Despite the utility of using formal social psychological theory to guide our understanding of the relationship between emotion and gender, it's probably worth noting that many sociologists, not just those who study emotion and gender, have long overlooked the potential contributions of formal social psychological theory. In fact, it's fair to say that social psychology has become increasingly marginalized, at least within U.S. sociology, having lost considerable ground to theorists who identify themselves simply as cultural sociologists. Evidence for this claim can be seen in the recent decline of academic programs that claim a social psychological focus among their specialty, as well as the decline in members of the social psych section of the American Sociological Association compared to the meteoric rise of the membership in the section on culture. Part of the disconnect between social psychological theory and more mainstream sociology has to do with the fact that much of social psychological theory has been derived, specified, tested, and elaborated in laboratory settings, or worse, using computer simulations. As I hope that my own work has revealed, these methodological distinctions are unnecessary and even harmful to our understanding of social phenomena and social processes. Emotion and gender scholars can benefit from drawing on insights from core social psychological theory, just as social psychologists can benefit from having their ideas tested, modified, and expanded upon in real-world settings by those who study gender and emotion. So that said, as a social psychologist who's committed to a better understanding of the relationship between gender and emotion, when I think about the future of work in this area, it seems to me that there are a number of next best steps that we can and should take as scholars interested in this topic. One, within sociology, sociologists need to take whatever steps necessary to eliminate the arbitrary and unnecessary theoretical and empirical divisions between the cultural, the structural, and the social psychological perspectives. This means that sociologists need to be more sensitive to social psychology, and that social psychologists need to make their theories more relevant and palatable to those tasteful, likable, to those outside of their own increasingly insular subfield. Two, we need to be more multi-methods. In a recent issue of Emotion Review, which is the International Society for Research on Emotions Association's third journal, a number of articles were published by sociologists who'd adopted multi-methodological approaches to their work. These multifaceted approaches allowed them to simultaneously assess physiological differences as well as real-time differences in expression, self-reported experience, talk about emotions, and attempts at emotion management. Three, we need to think more comparatively. And I don't mean just the difference between men and women. I mean differences across domains, institutions, regions, and countries. We need to think more long-term. Currently, we lack a systematic longitudinal record of affect, emotion, or sentiment, either across sectionality or across the life course. They're cross-sectionally or across the life course. We also need to do more to reach across disciplinary borders. Emotion and gender are both topics best studied from multiple perspectives. And here I don't just mean the usual suspects of biology, psychology, and neuroscience, but also anthropology, economics, women and gender studies, queer studies, history, philosophy, and comparative literature, among others. And as social scientists, we need to be critical. In particular, we need to think very critically about what it is that we're trying to study. When I first started in this field, I received many questions about how I was measuring emotion. Since that time, however, we've gotten very sophisticated at capturing emotion at the level of meaning, of expression, of language, and now physiology. So when I caution emotion scholars to think critically about the things that they're studying, I'm actually not talking about emotion. Because if we accept the assumption that gender differences in emotion are the cultural responses to structural conditions, we need to get very serious about understanding structure. And I'm thinking about rethinking what we mean when we talk about work, which has been completely transformed over the last decade. I'm talking about rethinking what we mean by family, where the power dynamics are shifting as men's jobs continue to disappear and the definition of marriage and family are in a state of flux. I'm talking about rethinking gender. What does it mean to talk about men and women when we now have a recognized third category, or fourth, if you make a distinction between trans men and trans women? And what does it mean to think about sex differences at all, when gender comprises a wide array of masculinities and femininities. And even if we get a clear definition on gender, what does that really tell us if we aren't also thinking about how gender intersects with race, ethnicity, nationality, social class, occupation, sexuality, political orientation, legal status, as well as any number of other important social demarcations? I'd like to take the last few minutes just to tell you a little bit about my next project, where I'm hoping to answer some of my own charges, but certainly not all of them. So as some of you already know, I'm a professor at a very small liberal arts college. So we have 4,500 students. So I can't even imagine being in this. So like many college campuses in the United States, we have systemic problems related to binge drinking, sexual assault, hazing, bullying, and microaggressions. So in order to combat many of these types of risky behaviors, the college is currently undergoing a number of large-scale structural changes, not the least of which is moving to a residential college model. So all of our students live on campus. So the college is creating 6 new community houses, establishing new social identities, and creating new social roles, such as house professor. So if you've seen Harry Potter or you read the books, you'll understand this next reference. Students will be sorted randomly into a house community upon their arrival on campus, and they will remain associated with that house during their entire 4 years there. They will live near their house professor, and they'll be able to engage regularly with members of their house in both informal and formal settings, academic as well as domestic type arrangements. And the people they'll be interacting with include other undergraduate students, graduate students, administrators, and staff. So beginning next year, my colleague and I will begin collecting Dartmouth-specific sentiment dictionaries, a la affect control theory, the contents of which will be derived from focus groups with students that will capture the affective meanings regarding identities, behaviors, settings, and attributes associated with college life, as well as emotions. Our goal in the first year is to collect EPA ratings from approximately 600 students, and then we'll follow approximately 150 of those students throughout their 4 years to see how their fundamental sentiments change as they move through the institution and as the institution moves around them. In year 5, we'll collect another dictionary from 600 students, and again in year 9, giving us a sentiment dictionaries at 3 points in time. By capturing the sentiments from a large group at 4-year intervals, we'll be able to determine whether the structural changes that the college is making is actually shifting the affective culture. By following individual students throughout their 4 years, it will also be possible to understand how sentiments influence students' choices about the types of organizations and activities that they're likely to join or engage in. We'll also be able to see how their involvement in certain organizations, say fraternities, sororities, or athletic teams, influence individuals' fundamental sentiments over time. And we'll also be able to account for gender differences in college-related sentiments, as well as differences by race, ethnicity, social class, Greek affiliation, and so on. Ideally, we would be able to do this comparatively, that is, by observing changes in different types of college campuses, either throughout the US or in other countries, especially those that may not be able to or inclined to attempt the same sorts of structural changes. So I'm just going to end by saying that the sociological study of gender and emotion has come a long way since 1985, but there are still many things that we don't know. I look forward to seeing what happens in the next 30, 40 years as we begin to think more creatively and inclusively about methods, theories, and interdisciplinary insights. So in the interest of time, I am going to wrap it up here. Bummer. So I know that you can't read these on screen, these citations, but I'll be happy to make these slides available if you would like to have access to the citations that I used in the talk. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for allowing me to share all of my thoughts today.
Wonderful. Muchísimas gracias, Kathryn. La verdad, creo que es impresionante. Ha sido una conferencia verdaderamente magistral en la que hemos visto la evolución del campo de una manera muy didáctica, muy clara, incluso para los que no están acostumbrados a los modelos, es claramente comprensible la evolución del campo a propósito de género y emociones. Entonces, les abro al público para interactuar con Kathryn. Si alguien, creo que podemos hablar en inglés, y si no, alguien quiere hablar en español, y alguno de los presentes ayudamos a traducir la pregunta. Así hicimos ayer, bueno, tuvimos ahí una reunión con ella muy, muy exitosa, sin ningún problema. Entonces, pues supongo que hay muchas preguntas a propósito de una evolución tan fascinante e interesante, complementaria, que viene a dar cuenta de que en el fondo las dos perspectivas son complementarias, nada más que tenemos que tener el ingenio metodológico para poder ver cómo ambas dicen parte de la realidad respecto de las emociones. Entonces hablo al público, debe de haber un micrófono que tiene Tania ya ahí. Preguntas, comentarios, reacciones. Están apabullados, yo creo. They're impressed. No, very clear, but they are shocked. A ver, puede ser incluso respecto de los temas que ustedes están investigando. Yo quisiera, bueno, yo voy a empezar con una pregunta. Entonces, tú hiciste una, sorry. You told us how to change from qualitative to quantitative. Now, if you turn the other way around, I mean, what is your evaluation of qualitative data now regarding this object?
Well, actually, after speaking to all of you in the seminar yesterday, I'm totally psyched to go do qualitative work because it's so much more interesting. No, I value both qualitative and quantitative work, and I'm not such a fan of experiments, but I see their value. I really see these things as complementary, just as the cultural and the structural and the social psychological perspectives are all necessary in order to advance our understanding. I see the methods the same way. Yes. And that you can use them complementary. You don't have to do everything, but you can use other people's work to bootstrap your own in ways that even if you're working with a small qualitative sample, you can use social psychological theories to show that these processes operate across a variety of contexts. And so I think the importance here is not to encourage all of you who are doing qualitative work to become survey methodologists or experimentalists, but to think about what you can learn from those types of studies in order to bolster or have more confidence about the work that you're doing qualitatively. Because as I said yesterday, and I guess I realize this is being taped, every good sociological idea that's ever been uttered was qualitative. And I see the survey methodologist as the people who test those, refine those ideas, maybe take them a little bit further. But again, I didn't trust my own results until I realized they were consistent with qualitative studies.
Comentario. I would like to know how to deal with the specificities of cultural differences when making such sentiment dictionaries. How to deal, I mean, for example, you are making those dictionaries in different areas of the United States. So how can you account for the contextual differences? By making the dictionary itself?
So cultural studies have long assumed, and people within sociology in the U.S. disagree about this, but affect control theorists and the cultural studies that they cite as evidence for their work show that these are broadly held, culturally defined. and so generally speaking, everyone, like if I did a little survey right now, you guys would pretty much all agree that where mothers lie versus where professors lie and things like that. And so, so in the United States, the dictionaries that they're using for the U.S. population, are actually done at universities. And so one was done at the University of Indiana. And what I meant to say is there's actually, and I forgot, is that on the Interact website, they actually have data from Ireland, Japan, Germany, Canada, 3 or 4 different points in time in the United States, like 2 different points in time in Germany. And so you can actually do cross-cultural, from your desk, you can actually look at cross-cultural differences in sentiments, like if you're so inclined. And they're currently processing the new U.S. dictionary that was actually collected at North Carolina. There's been a lot of testing against subcultures, and the basic identities and behaviors, really there aren't many differences by region of the country. However, you can get into subcultures, and there are big differences. And so Lynn Smith-Levin and somebody named Douglas something did a study of, they compared, they collected dictionaries from a fundamentalist Christian church and then a very sort of liberal church that was predominantly gay and lesbian. And they found that the basic sentiments, like about mothers, fathers, teachers, sons, daughters, were the same, but definitions or sentiments around like lesbian, gay, homosexual, or behaviors associated that were related to gay or lesbian activity were very, very different. And so one of the
Specific.
so there's the
for specific.
yes, and so for example, and one of Heiss always studied really sort of deviant things, because that was one of his areas of. So he did sentiment dictionaries, for example, between people who had never tried drugs versus people who had tried marijuana versus people who had tried cocaine versus people who had tried psychedelics like LSD, and found that different groups had different affective sentiments around certain types of drug-related behavior based on which group that you belong to. Needless to say that people who had tried psychedelics were much more positive about all of the other identities, whereas people who had either had never had drugs or had stopped at marijuana were much more negative. And so subcultural differences, to the degree that those identities or behaviors are related to the subculture, are different. But the basic dictionary of the sort of general, the general identities that everybody has access to seem to be remarkably stable across culture. Now there are significant differences. There are not that many differences between the United States and Canada, as you can imagine, but there's a lot of differences, particularly related to gender, between the United States and Japan. Also between different types of individual versus collective types of behaviors are also very different between the United States and Japan. I would love to know what the differences are between the United States and, say, Mexico, because of the stronger religious association, the different family structures and things like that. If anyone's interested, I would love to see that data. So one of the things is you take, well, to be honest, I don't know exactly all the details, but I'm going to find out when I do my study. Affect control theory is one of the most documented methodologies, and part of that is Dave Heiss is retired and he's very old, and so he's just been spitting out book after book about how to collect this stuff because he wants his theory to live. And so the easiest way, and people have done it different ways, some people take pen and paper, you sit down with a group of people and you just have them rate identities using those scales. And so if you were to go to your class and you were to say, okay, let's rate mother on blah, 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 you'll get roughly, they'll all sort of cluster around here, and then you sort of take the mean. So that's eventually how it gets, so it's actually relatively straightforward. It's getting more complicated. It can be more complicated than that because there's different ways. Heiss has a book called Surveying Cultures, in which he answers these questions. And he actually, in that book, he lays out a methodological approach which he argues will help qualitative scholars better sort of defend their work.
Okay.
There's also an online tool that is currently defunct, but they're working on it, where you can actually, you put it on a computer, and you'll send out emails to students, and they can just log right in and do the surveys directly online, and all of that will get rolled into a database. So it's pretty straightforward, and it's very well documented. I would say that the university that's most cutting edge in terms of the methods right now is either Duke University, where Lynn Smith Lovin is, or University of Georgia, where Don Robinson is working.
A question here, please.
More than a question.
Just wait for the microphone, please.
Well, just a little commentary about your paper, your controversial paper that you said about parenthood and.
It wasn't mine, but it was somebody else's.
Oh, okay, sorry. Well, that one that you referred to. Sorry. I guess in my generation, I think it would be pretty obvious for me that parents have more stress,
Me too.
More depression, everything. So maybe that's a conception older, right? About, well, probably what you referred, or why it's so controversial is because we would like it to be something that brings happiness to your life, to have kids and fulfillment, but stress and depression, that's pretty obvious, at least for me.
I actually think that it's because that's the story that parents tell themselves, that they're going to be happier, that's the only reason they would have children. And so I'm sorry. Of course parents are happier than non-parents. Robin was totally wrong. There's obviously other who's expecting. So obviously there are benefits to being parents, but being exposed to stressors is probably not one of them.
I think I have one. So could you talk a little bit more about the GSS, like the survey you said you used for your first papers? And how you used it?
Yeah, the General Social Survey. And so in 1996, and I've been asked to write a second emotions module, and I haven't actually taken up that torch yet, but I might, because I think it's really important. And so every year, the General Social Survey sends out, it's actually one of the most well-known surveys among social scientists within the US. And they have topics that covers everything in the general, but then they have specialty modules. So they do a specialty module on gender, one on mental health, emotions, politics, voting, behaviors, and things like that. And so the one on emotions had questions like, in the last 7 days, how many times did you experience X? And so like anger, rage, fear, excitement, hope, joy, and things like that. And so that was the first sort of set of questions. And so I used those questions many different ways. So in the housework paper that I talked about equity, we did latent variables. So we did measurement models and showed that, that there were certain of it was calm, at ease, and happy, like all clustered together nicely. And so we call that happiness. And, or we call it tranquility, actually. And then joy, or overjoyed, was different, was over here, so it was its own emotion. And so I would use those as dependent variables. So how did those variables vary with perceptions of inequity? So I used it that way. But they also had a subsection of questions about anger. And so think of the time in which you were most angry in the last 30 days. And then they ask about, who was that person, who did it involve? And so if it involved, and they had lots of different people, it would be like, husband, wife, daughter, son. And so I coded all those together as family. So that was if it involved any of those people that happened within the family. And then there are all of these people at work, like work identities, like boss, client, subordinate, clerk, administrative, whatever. And so those became the work variable. And so that's how I used those. And then there was a set of questions about how did you attempt to manage that anger. And so there were a ton of responses, which had to do with hitting a wall, drinking, taking a drug, trying not to think about it, talking to someone else, talking to the person you were mad at, pretending it was going to go away, exercising, and all of those things. So I used all of those because there were too many to make sense of. I collapsed those into variables such as, did you talk to the person? Did you talk to the person and to someone else? Did you talk to someone else and not that person to make them mutually exclusive? And then all of those other more cognitive strategies, the intrapersonal emotion management, I put into the did nothing or said nothing at all. And so, and other people have used them in different ways. So like Robin Simon and Leda Nath, in their paper, they actually looked at gender differences in emotion management strategies. And what they found very few, but what they did find was that men were more likely to drink or take a drug in order to manage their feelings. They were more likely to yell or hit a wall. Women were more likely to speak to others to try to manage their emotions that way, or to try to think about it in a different way. They also asked questions about how proud you were to be an American, which I certainly wish that they had done that, post 9/11, and then 10 years later when we're all tired of 9/11. But because I did that, and no one ever did anything with those at all. And so they were just really basic questions that most qualitative scholars would be like, oh my God, those are the worst questions ever. But when you can put them together and test some of the patterns and things that we have been finding in the qualitative results. So my first paper, my dissertation, were on paralegals, and because it was in the workplace, and I was looking within stratified relationships, and I was looking at talking to other people, the questions in the GSS actually almost mirrored some of the qualitative questions that I asked. So I was able to test some of the assumptions that I had made about status in the workplace and how people were likely to manage their emotions when they were mad at someone of a higher status, being the attorney, versus if they were mad at someone of lower status, like the secretary, because I had qualitative data. And so one of the results is that we were comparing about people who were likely, so people at likely work were more likely to say something to someone else and then to talk to someone else and the target of their anger. And I was like, but what does that mean? What does that really tell us? And so I actually wrote another paper where I went back to my qualitative data and said, there are actually 3 patterns which could explain what was going on in this variable. 3 different patterns. And so some people, if they spoke to the target and they spoke to someone else, they would go yell at the target because they just and then they would go freak out with their coworker in order to manage the stress because they had just yelled at their boss. So it happens, that was one pattern. One pattern would be is they would go talk to their coworker in order to help manage the feeling, to change it into something more palatable, and then they would go talk to their boss. And so there were different ways, but see, that variable didn't capture the process, but it allowed me to see how often that process occurred in a broad general population of adults that went above and beyond my small sample of 52 paralegals that were interviewed in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Not so small, 52. Not so small.
Small compared to 1,400.
Yes.
You have a question? You're my husband.
I should say I'm not a sociologist. I'm the loving spouse of a sociologist. But I think it's worth just mentioning one way to use affect control theory on the Interact computer program is that you can generate hypotheses for testing. You can sit at your desk and have ideas and see discrepancies that might lead to qualitative or further quantitative studies. And it can really be an idea generator. And I've heard you talk about that other places. You might want to just, if there's anything more to say than that.
Oh, so actually when we were, so in the paper, I guess it was the emotional expression paper that I did with Brian Powell, we generated competing hypotheses. And so we used the cultural perspective, we used Kemper's, the structural perspective, and actually used equity theory just the basic distress thing. We used Kemper, but then we also used Interact to actually get at gender differences, because Kemper doesn't talk about gender differences. Like, he assumes that that we all have this idea, and if you don't get the amount of power or status that you think you deserve, then you're going to have this emotional response. But affect control theory allowed us to model those using, like, spouse, like, takes advantage of spouse, or spouse cheats spouse, or I can't remember exactly which events we used, but we ran them from both the male and the female data perspective, the male and the female sentiments, which gave us really systematic, nuanced hypotheses, which turned out to be correct, even using the GSS data. So I've actually almost always, when I'm creating hypotheses, try to figure out a way to model it in affect control theory, because it's almost always right. And part of the reason why it's almost always right is that it's really just, they figured out how to mathematically model the basic understandings of symbolic interaction. And so if you think about Hochschild's original study, she said, that when you're trying to manage your emotion, you relabel the person in a certain way and your emotional response follows. And so in affect control theory, when the mother kicks the baby, like, how do you make sense of that event? You label the mother as a bad mother. Well, of course, the bad mother kicks the baby, and so your emotions go down. When you relabel the passenger as a scared little child, then you're no longer mad at them. And so affect control theory, in many ways, it's the mathematical application of symbolic interaction, and it's very, very consistent with the cultural theory of emotion management. So I talked about that a lot, too, in the chapter, which I know that you gave me.
Yes. It seems, can we say that the study you have made with affect control theory validates the affirmation that depression might be a structural product mediated by culture? In women depression. I mean, because you know that health studies always say that depression is something more frequent in women than in men. Mm-hmm. So can we reframe that as a byproduct between structural and cultural factors?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, we can. And I don't know that there. I actually don't know that affect control theory is the best way to do that. However, I think that if you go back to the sort of the structural things about how that people in lower status situations, which women often are, that women are more likely to have their identities disconfirmed. Yes. And so in the workplace, for example, oftentimes women sort of see themselves in their institutional role as professor or CEO or manager or this, and people see them as women. Or they see them as a female CEO or a female professor. And so when people are responding to you as a female professor, so just by marking you as female, that lowers your potency and your evaluation. And so people treat you differently. So if you're seeing yourself with higher evaluation and more potency, but yet you're being treated, then that discrepancy can, one, result in anger, in which over time, again, drawing back from Collins, can result in depression. And so any identity that's marked, so if you say a black physician or a Latina CEO or a female physician, just by being marked lowers your potency and your evaluation.
They're going to go tomorrow to look.
That they're amazed.
No, they are. Yeah. So, any question? They may be shy also because of the English. Here. Yes.
Well, if I had to speak Spanish, I would say that.
Well, I'm a native speaker of English, so I'm not shy about speaking in English. Can you talk to us? I'm really fascinated by these dictionaries, and I'm not a sociologist. If anything, I work in cultural studies or cultural history, and I'm interested in change over time. and how you've spotted vocabularies changing over time. And I was really struck by the question of like issues around gender and transgender at the moment as well. And just these changes, because I was thinking 1996, that's nearly 20 years ago. And so many changes have registered in those years.
Well, the 1996 data was basically the General Social Survey, which this doesn't really deal with the dictionaries. And so those are just the emotions and the structures. And yes, I realize that that's really old data at this point. The dictionaries, however, we currently have, so there's one in 1979 for the US. There's 2002, 2004, and there's currently one being processed at Georgia, which is 2010, 2011. And there has been significant changes in particularly like female or woman. And so there was a huge drop. And what's I would say, as a social psychologist, I think it's fascinating. As a woman, I think it's really sad that women see themselves as very good and very, very, very powerful. And men really see them very, very differently. And it's, and so when you think about men and women interactions having this sort of different definition of what it means, and of course women also see men as fairly negative, or they rate men as fairly negative, but powerful, and men see themselves as very positive and powerful. And so you can actually really model out really interesting interactions. So for example, if you actually plug in woman or man, I think it's flirts with or talks to a woman in a bar, the next behavior that would confirm his understanding of the situation would be to have sex with the woman. And hers is to be sexually aroused, which is similar, but it's very different. So sexually aroused could be flirted with, danced with, bought a drink, kissed or whatever. And so you can see where you begin to have these issues about sexual assault and different definitions of situations. I haven't seen the new ratings yet for women, and I don't know that they've actually got transgender identities in there. However, we'll be collecting them in our college dictionary because, just because. I just don't know what they've included in that dictionary.
But are lexical items falling in and out of use in these dictionaries?
There are some that have fallen in and out of use. And so, for example, I'm doing another project right now that has nothing to do with gender, but are looking at the decline in trust over time of patient-provider trust over time. And so we're looking at trust violating behaviors in 1979 versus 2002 versus 2010 and 2011. And it's a linear pattern. But we had to be really careful about some of the behaviors had fallen out that we were using to characterize trust violations. Some of the identities, social worker, for example, is in two of the dictionaries, but not one of them, and so we weren't able to include it. And so they're trying to be much more systematic, but again, if you look at some of these, bootlicker, does anyone use that term anymore? There are some in there that are really weird, but they're still in dictionaries. And how Heiss originally picked what identities to use is he actually went through 3 of the major dictionaries and actually literally pulled out every identity that was in there, and that became the basis of the dictionary. And so as new identities and new behaviors change, they will be added, but you might not be able to do longitudinal analysis because they weren't in there originally. Does that make sense? But yes, the sexual identities, even gay, lesbian, bisexual, have changed over time. And I'm sure that they'll continue to change, even from 2010, if we were to do it again in 2015, 2020, it would be significantly different. And so that's actually why I like affect control theory, is that even though it may not be able to get at all of the questions you're interested in, it does allow you to see change over time. It allows you to do comparative work, and it allows you to look at particularly specific events that are situated within particular social contexts.
And well, a little bit more about that software that you showed us that we can play with. I found that really cool, that it's something that the Indiana University gave to whoever is interested, right? The development of that software, is it the sociologists paired with computer scientists that do those logarithms? How do they or it's a work of sociologists interested in math, or?
So David Heiss is one of the most unbelievably brilliant people I've ever met. He's very mathematically inclined. He came up with all of the equations himself. And so these are impression formation equations that are available in any of the publications on affect control theory. He did design this Java programming, which is partly why it's so clunky. And so you have people at Duke and University of Georgia who are currently trying to make it better and easier to use and more intuitive. And then there's also a whole new wave of computer scientists who've gotten interested in affect control theory from Belgium and Germany and Canada, who are actually creating now what's called BASACT. And so they're using Bayesian analysis. So instead of looking at differences in means, which is what this version is using, they're actually using Bayesian analysis so that none of the data is lost. So you're not just looking at the mean EPA score, you're actually looking at the entire distribution. And so they're getting much more nuanced predictions. I don't understand it at all. My newest colleague at Dartmouth is one of the people who is working on BASACT, so I'm hoping that in a couple of years I will have figured it out. But yeah, so right now there is a serious confluence of computer scientists, sociologists, and so like Heiss was like president of the Society for Mathematical Sociology, et cetera. And so there's right now there's a greater confluence of people. And so the technology is getting more and more sophisticated. Even more sophisticated.
Thank you.
Again, I'll make these slides available, and where the URL is there, and you can just. I would highly recommend working through the PDF. Like if you taking an afternoon and just doing it. I did it earlier this year with one of my colleagues who wasn't familiar with affect control theory, and I learned a lot just by. It's very, very systematic, and so a lot of sociologists who study emotion, they look at ACT and their eyes just glaze over. They're like, how can you predict emotion using math? But you can actually. It's really fascinating. So a lot of sociologists who study emotion qualitatively, they look at this stuff and they just glaze over. And so I wrote a chapter with Heiss, and we actually showed how all of this qualitative research was supported by affect control theory. And I ran into Jen Lois, whose book I cited, and I said, oh yeah, we cited 3 of your articles in this chapter with affect control theory. And she was like, what does my stuff have to do with affect control theory? And I was like, well, we modeled what you said, and it worked perfectly. And so they don't see the connection. And so this is just one example of why so the qualitative scholars are often shut out of the big journals, or they're not taken as seriously, but there's some real mathematical theoretical underpinnings that they could be using in order to shore up their scholarship. That book chapter that I saw you handing out yesterday.
Okay.
And for those of you who got that from her, it has a lot of the citations that I was using.
Well, muchísimas gracias, creo que ya es suficiente, ha estado hablando bastante rato desde ayer. Entonces yo me voy a despedir en inglés para que ella entienda, para no, ¿verdad? Thank you very much for coming. It was an excellent presentation. It was an excellent conference for us. And we are very pleased to have you here, and I hope we will bring you again. Thank you everyone for staying and for coming. Thank you.